SAS, and then we're having a science meeting in mid-March for all of CIMMYT. We all need time to get to know each other. So this seminar series is really helpful in terms of opportunity to learn what each other are doing. And some of you may not yet have met Frédéric Goulet, who I'm going to introduce in a minute. But we're really, really pleased. I would like to actually build more expertise in this area. We need, there's a funny thing in CG centers called socioeconomists, which there's no such thing. There's sociologists, geographers, social scientists, anthropologists, and there's economists, ag economists, applied economists, and gender specialists. There's all these people in these different spaces, but I guess it's just a shortcut to call them all socioeconomists, but I want to build up the qualitative and the social sciences as well. And so we really appreciate, again, Frédéric being a visiting scientist with us from CIRAD. I think I'm going to go ahead and start introducing you, Frédéric, and then we can hear what you're going to share with us today, which I'm very excited about. So you're a researcher at CIRAD, which of course is in France, and is world famous for its systems research, with a PhD in sociology. But what I'm really excited about is you specialize in science, technology, and innovation, because we really need to understand innovation processes and adoption, how conservation agriculture, which you've worked in quite a lot, how public policies, farmers, practices interact, how science industry relationships, and their science and research, how we impact society, and in turn, how society impacts farmer decision making. I see that you've worked on the development of science for social inclusion as well, which is again a big theme in SAS, and have particularly worked with research centers in Argentina, which I didn't realize fully, because you were visiting researcher at INTA in Argentina, and a visiting professor at Universidade Federal Rural de Rio de Janeiro. And now, since September, you've been a visiting scientist at CIMMYT in our program, Sustainable Ag Food Systems, collaborating particularly with Jelle van Loon. And finally, not everyone knows that you're the coordinator of a network called Public Policies and Rural Development in Latin America, a network of scientists and institutions acting on agriculture and rural development policies in Latin America. We're thrilled to have you and really look forward to your vision today. And I'm sure there'll be really good questions for you and opportunities to interact. Over to you, Frédéric.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your introduction. Good morning to all of you, or good afternoon, wherever you are. So thank you, Sig. Thank you to the SAS program and team for giving me the opportunity to introduce myself and to introduce the research work I've been carrying out during last year in the fields of science, technology, and innovation studies. So I have two screens, so I have to, yeah, that works. So I'm a social scientist. I work for CIRAD. CIRAD is the French Agricultural Research for Development Institute, with headquarters in Montpellier, in the south of France, when we have the headquarters of the CGIAR now. I joined CIMMYT, as you say, in the SAS program in September 2022, so 5 months ago, through an agreement between our two institutions. My research area is science, technology, and innovation studies, which means that I look at the social or socio-technical, to use a complicated word, dimension of scientific and technological activities and innovations. I handle frameworks for analyzing socio-technical transitions, which is more than a buzzword that we are all using now. This is a concept in science and technology studies. I look at the relationships between agricultural research and input industry, the role of input industry in transforming agricultural practices, but also mobilization of farmers around technology, and then the roles of the state in promoting, supervising, or even sometimes discriminating against technology. So the topics I've worked on are mainly conservation agriculture, as you say, but also agricultural equipment, machinery, and biological inputs as alternatives to chemical inputs. And I've worked mainly in Europe, but also in Latin America, in South American countries like Argentina and Brazil, and since a few months in Mexico within the SAS program. So the main points of my presentation today, I will try to introduce you to some of my research questions in the field of science, technology, innovation studies. I will try to do so in a pedagogical way without drowning you in the complicated concept that we love so much in social sciences. But the general question that I will address here is how sustainability questions, how sustainability challenges the questions, the way we should or we can analyze innovation and innovation processes. So I will address the following points. I will ask how sustainability invites us to reconsider the role of certain technologies, but also how it makes visible in particular certain mechanisms that until now have been under considered in the study of innovations, and how this can lead us to rethink the way to promote innovations. To do this, I will draw an example I've been working on in the field of, as I said, conservation agriculture and biological inputs. And I will try to reposition this in the general literature and trends on innovation studies. I will organize my presentation in two parts. The first part, I will try to return some generic concepts and elements in the study of innovations. And in the second part, I will focus on the question of the decline and emergence of technologies. So to begin with, I suggest that we look at a tension that exists in many societies, or at least in those societies where there is some awareness of sustainability issues. This tension is the one that characterizes our complex relationship with technology, in which the German sociologist Ulrich Beck described in his classic book, The Risk Society. The problem is the following. Technologies are seen as a source of progress. They are the solution to our problems, sometimes perhaps in an exaggerated way, as the picture on the left suggests. But at the same time, we also know that some technologies, or at least their misuses, can also create problems, generate issues for people and their environment and people health. So this is a trend in many sectors. So we can observe this in many sectors, and the fact that more and more often we seek to detach ourselves from certain technologies, precisely to avoid their disadvantages overtaking their benefits. I'll give you a few examples, and if you start looking at our surrounding world in this way, you will find many more examples. So what all these examples have in common is that they are based on the desire, the wish to avoid certain technology, or at least to reduce their use, or to reduce our dependence on those technologies. This is the case. This is the picture we have on the left, for example, with the cosmetic sectors, which promotes paraben-free products. This is the case for urbanism and transportation, the desire to exclude cars from city centers. And another example we know, as we are traveling a lot, to limit air travel, which emits too much carbon in the atmosphere. This is also the case in the field of consumption. There is a strong desire to emancipate ourselves from plastic, or more broadly from food packaging, notably with the development of bulk cells. And of course, the agriculture and food sector is full, absolutely full of examples of these technologies, these problematic technologies, some of them inherited from the Green Revolution. This is the case, for example, with deep plowing, which causes soil erosion. This is, of course, the case with chemical fertilizers, which, if they are used in excessively high quantity, cause water pollution, and which more have now become extremely expensive because of the energy crisis. This is also the case, of course, with pesticides, with their effects on human health or biodiversity. You can see on the right this study on the evolution of insect population. This works also with antibiotics, which again, when they are used incorrectly, are responsible for the development of resistance. And beyond this example that directly concern agricultural practices, if we look at food industry, we discover the importance of this desire to do without, or to do at least with less, certain inputs. Basically, organic farming is based on the absence of chemical inputs. We have the example of palm oil-free food without coloring, without preservatives, without meat. So in short, the challenges of sustainability, the relationship we have now with technologies, are leading industries and consumers increasingly towards the detachment from certain technologies that were previously omnipresent in our lifestyles. So some trends and questions. In many cases, innovation and change is based precisely on removing or reducing the presence of certain technology and products. The without, the no, the free, the less, they have become starting points for change and innovation. So innovation is not just about doing something or introducing something new. It is also about ending or reducing the use of certain technologies. But the problem is that we have two biases in the way we think innovation. The first one is that we usually think in terms of something more when we think about innovation. And we have a great collection of words referring to that. So introduction, diffusion, adoption, dissemination, scaling up. And the second bias we have is that, and this is probably even more profound in our thinking, in our understanding, reducing or removing things, reducing or removing elements to solve problems is in some way deeply contradictory to the way we think as human beings. Here I'm referring to this great paper published 2 years ago in Nature in the field of cognitive sciences. Here the authors show that when we try to solve a problem or improve a situation, in this case, that was the case study experimentally were recipes in kitchen or writing a text. When we try to improve situation, we tend to add something, to add an ingredient, to add a section to a text, when it would have been in many occasions more efficient to remove something, to remove some elements already present. So all these elements, the question then becomes for social scientists, for innovation studies, to design and develop concepts and framework of analysis to qualify these processes and to eventually contribute to transform reality. So this is what I've been trying to do for the last years, at least 10 years, with a number of colleagues here. In 2012, we proposed the concept of innovation by withdrawal, based on my PhD work on the development of conservation agriculture in France. So we've been studying the development of this technology, conservation agriculture, because this is a pool of technologies. And we came to the conclusion that the promoters, observing them, of conservation agriculture, researchers, extension services, agricultural equipment, or alternative fertilizers companies, they spent more time and energy convincing farmers to stop plowing than adopting new technologies, or at least that the two processes were carried out at the same time. And in fact, when we talk about no-till, this is no-till, siembra directa in Spanish, or plantio directo in Portuguese, or semi-direct in French, we have that word direct, because we remove something. We remove a step, we remove an action, we remove a technology that was previously done before sowing the seeds into the soil. And I will come back to this case in detail later. So we have deepened the reflection by repositioning it in the classical literature on innovation studies. Here we can see in the title the reference to Joseph Schumpeter's work, to the idea that innovation always has a destructive component, except that there is now this is a structuring element of the innovation we are looking at. I will take just here a small example and make a parenthesis to illustrate the difference with what Schumpeter said almost a century ago. Taking the example of the mobile phone. Development of the mobile phone led to the disappearance of public phones in the street. Public phone boxes, there is no public phones anymore, almost. But it wasn't the objective of the invention of the mobile phone. Indeed, public phones did not cause any problem to anyone, did not harm anyone, and no one consciously developed this innovation in order to eliminate no one consciously developed the mobile phone in order to eliminate the public phone from the street. But this is a very different situation from those we explicitly try, for example, to get cars out of the city, where we try because they cause pollution, or we want to reduce the use of carbon-based energy because it causes a climate change. And then we have to find alternative. This is really different. This is the starting point of changes we are observing now. And of course, I'm not the only one about thinking about this. And for the last 10 years, there has been a fairly extensive literature with various concepts. So we talk about ending, we talk about destabilization, about ways out, about decline, about discontinuation, and many other concepts, with a certain leaderships of the research community working on transition and the multi-level perspective. So I'll give you here a few reference titles here, but there are many others. So here is the first part on the concept and challenges for innovation studies raised by this issue of sustainability and this new relationship we have with technologies. In the second part, I would like to insist now on the question of alternatives. Because here it is important to be clear. And using less of certain resources, exit from certain technology and social technical systems, stopping doing certain things or certain ways of doing things, does not mean doing nothing or stopping everything. If a consensus is forming around the issue of moving away from major social technical systems, this does not mean that we are resigned to a dead end. This is not it. Rather, it means that we need to look for alternative pathways, alternative technologies, and this is also what we need to consider innovation studies, so as not to reduce doing the same mistake in reverse in some way. Or in other words, just because the study of the mechanism of destruction were underestimated in the past does not mean that the study of the processes of constriction and emergence of alternatives and novelty should be disregarded when we consider decline of technology. So here is a slide, on this slide, a figure that I discovered thanks to my colleague Eva Valencia and Lena Woltering from the SAS program here in El Batan. I think you know them, they are the specialists in scaling up processes. This figure is called X-curve. And it's interesting because it explicitly mentions the idea that the processes of decline and emergence of technologies are tightly connected. For a new technology to emerge, an existing technology must decline and vice versa. And the moment of destabilization, when a technology begins to lose its domination and the new technology emerges, but is not yet fully developed, creates a moment of what they call it chaos, where actors or markets are deeply destabilized. And this is a very interesting figure, even if it is not perfect, as we will see, in particular around this idea of chaos. But I propose to keep this idea of the combination of decline and emergence in order to revisit two cases of agriculture technology that I've been working on. So you know very well at CIMMYT the first one, because this is conservation agriculture, and the second one is biological control as alternative to the use of pesticides. Well, the case of conservation agriculture, I start with that one, as I was saying earlier. It's because when we look closely at the development projects for this technology, I've been studying it mainly in France and Argentina, we realize that its promoters, as I said, researchers, extension services, equipment companies, they all deploy a certain creativity in demonstrating that farmers' existing practices are not viable, are not sustainable. Demonstrating in particular that the export of straw and the use of tillage cause erosion and destroy farmers' soil capital. They also try to demonstrate to the farmers that stopping tillage and burning or exporting straw is a way to drastically reduce production costs, increase margins, and be more competitive and save water. This is important in the case of Mexico. And also that those practices are blowing or tillage are responsible for a degradation of soil fertility. And also the last point, so this is more a symbolic level, perhaps not so much in developing countries, but that was really important in Europe or Argentina, that these are practices of the past. Plowing is a practice of the past, of an agriculture that today has fewer and fewer good reasons to exist, and that farmers have two options. The first one is to be farmers of the past, locked into traditions, to continue plowing and perhaps soon disappear with their soils. Or the second option, to be farmer of the future and to prosper with their healthy soils. So the different actors who try to promote conservation agriculture, they make efforts, they deploy strategy, demonstrations to encourage farmers to stop doing what they're doing, or even what they have been doing even for decades and generations. But this only works if, in parallel, alternatives are introduced that allow production to continue to go on without tilling the soil and to sow with a thick mulch cover on the ground. These alternatives are specific sowing machines, superficial tilling tools, of course, the installation of a mulch to prevent weeds from germinating, and finally, sometimes herbicides that will make it possible to do chemically that was done with tillage to destroy weeds. What is interesting with conservation agriculture is this is not just a question of introducing new things, it's also a question of making visible to farmers some auxiliaries to which they were not really sensitive until now. This is the case in particular with all the biological soil biological activity with the earthworms and all the soil fauna which prosper in conservation agricultural soils, and which will carry out a sort of biological plowing instead of mechanical plowing. This picture is very interesting. I got it from an agricultural equipment company that was using it for its promotion in France, but also in Argentina and in Paraguay. So if we take the case of conservation agriculture, we can here clearly see the importance of thinking together the mechanisms of withdrawal and addition, or decline and emergence, in order to understand the complexity of the process. These are the two processes that are promoted in order to avoid any situation of chaos, precisely. Because rather than chaos, there's a series of small adjustments or adaptations. Adjustments must be promoted to make the transition effective. Technological adjustments, arrangements, the importance of developing intermediate practices, for example, with localized surface tillage, biological transformation that take time, of course, and a work on the farmer's mindset, which also takes time and requires spatial social engineering. So that's with the first example. And let's take the second one about microbiological inputs. I've been working on that case over the last few years in Latin America, in particular in Argentina and Brazil, which refers to the development of alternatives to chemical inputs, fertilizers and pesticides. And more specifically, I've been working on the development of microorganisms. So I've been working on how these technologies have developed in recent years, looking in particular at how the category of bioinputs, this is the local category we use in Latin America, bioinsumos in Spanish or in Portuguese, how this category has emerged in public policy and in the agriculture research landscape. So this concept is now present quite everywhere in Latin America, including countries like Brazil, Argentina, Colombia, Uruguay, and of course, Mexico, with the strong public policy in favor of bioinputs. Well, this category of bioinputs is composed of two subcategories, biofertilizers and biocontrol. Here I mentioned microorganisms used for bioinoculants and biological control. In particular, I looked at how microorganisms, here those bacteria and fungi have been developed, especially among farmers who produce themselves for their own use. So these are technologies that have been known for a long time. This is not totally new, but which have experienced a boom clearly a boom in the recent years in Latin America because of increasing costs of chemical inputs and concerns about pesticide residues for countries exporting to the US or the European Union, and particularly Brazil with the soybean crops. And what is interesting with that example is that we can get with that one a broader picture of how these emerging technologies have gradually come to occupy a technological landscape dominated by the chemical inputs in different spheres, political sphere, industry, science, and of course the farm level. And how they are coexisting with some technologies that are supposed to replace the one we are who are supposed to decline. I mean the chemical inputs. Here, that figure just to give you some idea of this recent growth. Here, the case of Brazil, with an annual growth of about 30–40% per year during the recent years. So this is a major growth, economical growth for those biological inputs. Well, I said what is interesting about this microorganism is that although they represent a major technological break with chemical inputs in terms of how they are produced, how they are used for the farmers, a break in terms of how they act on the crops, in terms of storage, in terms of risks, because they have also biological risks. But once again, we observe some micro and macro adjustments, arrangements, which mean that this technology are progressively becoming part of the dominant social technical system built around industrial agriculture and chemical inputs. And this can be seen at 4 levels. And I'm going to explain that 4 levels. First, we can observe a form of biotechnologization, sorry for the complicated word, biotechnologization of biological inputs. We are talking about technologies that are designed and developed in laboratories by startups when we talk about microbiology from the biotech world, clearly, and which work on microorganisms for fertilization as well for biological controls. And when we know that, mainly in the case of Argentina and Brazil, agriculture biotechnology is very important, especially with GMOs. We see clearly that these alternative technologies are well positioned in the dominant industrial universe. Here, I have put an advertisement for a bioinoculant company in Brazil with the techno-scientific symbolism that clearly stands out and announcing things. So biological inputs is not esoteric at all. This is not a hippie thing. This is not an alternative thing. This is big science. This is big technology. This is not so alternative. The second level that shows this convergence is the one of the public policies. Because in both Brazil and Argentina, we find a similar positioning of bioinputs program within the public administrations. Originally, remember that biological inputs have existed for a long time. The areas of the ministries of agriculture that deal with these technologies were those related to alternative agriculture, family farming, agroecology, organic farming, alternative things. But with the recent boom and dedicated public policy for this technology, this is radically different. In Argentina, they were placed bioinputs in a commission dependent on the National Biotechnology Commission. And in Brazil, they were placed in a national innovation department as the commission that dealt with organic farming and agroecology was dissolved by the Bolsonaro government. The third level is of these adjustments and convergence is at the industrial level. From 2000 onwards, agrochemical multinational companies, they began to invest heavily in the microorganism sector, mainly by buying national startups. And in the case of Brazil, this process culminated in 2019 with the merger of the National Association of Biological Control Industry with CropLife. So you know what is CropLife, the Association of Agrochemical and Biotechnology Industries. So in the case of Brazil, there are no longer 2 separate industries, but only one, and only one industry combining chemistry and biology, chemical and biological inputs. And finally, The fourth level is the one of agricultural practices. In practice, when we observe that conventional farmers who use microbiological inputs, they all use both chemical and biological products in a kind of integrated approach. Microorganisms are many times the basis, but chemicals are used almost systematically as a kind of complement. And this is even a marketing argument for companies selling microorganisms who prefer to play up the convergence, the complementarity between the two types of technologies. Here, on the left, cycle in red, you can see the leaflet of a fungus-based bioinsecticide, for which the possibility is of using it in rotation with other chemical insecticide is clearly announced. So this is clearly an argument. And in the second picture, we have here a table provided by a microorganism company, Brazilian one, indicating the possible mixtures of microorganisms and chemical pesticide directly in the spray tank. So if you see it red, green, you can mix that biological inputs with that kind of molecules. So here again, we have a perfect complementarity assumed by the actors between chemical technologies that we are seeking to reduce and alternative technologies, and not at all a rupture or a chaos. So I come back to this figure to discuss it and to understand the link with the two processes. At the opposite from what is shown in the figure, we can clearly see that the transition from one technology to the other does not really involve chaos, but rather a series of arrangements, alignments, compatibility, convergence, rather than the divergence that the shape of the two curves would suggest. And it is when we observe the reality, the art of the public policies, of private companies, of extension actors and farmers to avoid precisely chaos in order to favor micro and macro continuities at the scales of the plot, at the scale of the farm, of the industrial sector, really to avoid chaos and to go on with production and economic activities. And this model of coexistence and convergence can be found in many other fields, where coexistence is the dominant norm. This is the case in particular in the energy sector with mixes with renewable energies and carbon energy, nuclear energy, or directly within technologies that are literally called hybrids. The hybrid car, working with fuel and with electric power. So some lessons and conclusions. I'd like to share you some reflections and returning to the original perspective. At the beginning, that is how sustainability issues invite innovation studies, sociologists of innovation, to move or to innovate in order to transform their conceptual frameworks. First of all, it is important to remember that any innovation processes includes a destruction component that has been shown by Schumpeter a century ago, even if until now we have been mainly interested in the introduction of new technologies in the context of perhaps the Industrial Revolution or the Green Revolution. But what is changing here is with sustainability issues, is that the challenges we are facing invites us to place the issues of withdrawal, reduction, and perhaps decline at the center of the analysis, as a starting point of our analysis, and not as an external or secondary aspect of innovation. And what is important also is not to think in a dichotomic way with the emergence versus decline or introduction versus withdrawal. The idea is to understand the complexity of the processes, and for that, this is necessary to think of the two sets in pairs in a symmetrical way: introduction, removal, promotion, discredit, or scaling up, scaling down. And when we try to introduce something, we have to think about the existing practices that we have to delegitimize, to problematize, so that the actors reduce their dependence from them, or are aware of the problematic aspect of their practices or technologies they are using. And let me just digress for a short moment. What I am describing now does not take us very far from the political rhetoric, when we know that political parties spend at least as much time criticizing opposition parties as they do defending their own proposals, when they have any, of course, but they spend the same energy criticizing and making propositions. Another point I have already mentioned, but it would seem that in the reality, when we observe the reality, for things to work and avoid collapse, transformation must take the form of a slow transition. And this is not a revolution, and this is not brutal ruptures. Actors, stakeholders organize at micro and macro levels technological transition. And I would go even further. It seems that actors organize continuity in the transition to maintain the equilibrium and structures in place and enable socio-technical systems to keep working and prevent collapse. Organizing transition in many cases means organizing a kind of change, but at the same time, a kind of continuity. But then I wonder, and I put this question to you, is that continuity, the way we deal with problems, we deal with transition as it is organized by the actors on the ground and by the dominant actors, of course, is that continuity adapted to address the emergency issues and the challenges we are facing? Is continuity compatible with sustainability? And I openly ask myself this question, and I ask it to you as well, because it seems that on some issues, if we consider the climate change issues, the way we manage transition is perhaps not enough, is not going too fast. But I don't have the answer, sorry, but because if you look at situation of, we can find some situation of accelerated exit or worst, unplanned exit. We have a lot of cases. And when we look at the situation, there's a lot to be afraid. If we look at the recent ban on chemical inputs in Sri Lanka, for example, we have an excellent example of the risks involved in not planning for the exit and entry of alternatives at the same time. This is a good example for that. Unplanned exit of chemical inputs without making or anticipating the promotion of alternative technologies. And if we take an example outside the agricultural sector in a more political field, I won't talk here about Brexit, but another case, we have also with that dramatic picture, an example of the dangers of unplanned and unanticipated withdrawal. I'm thinking, of course, of the withdrawal of Western troops from Afghanistan after the Taliban took power, which also resulted in an absolute chaos. This is chaos in that case, because this is, again, the case of unanticipated and unplanned withdrawal. So that's it for me. These are the reflections I wanted to share with you today. I'm fully aware that I'm leaving you perhaps with doubts and questions rather than certainties, but I apologize for that, but this is what I wanted to share with you today. Thank you very much for your attention and at your disposal for discussion and questions, of course. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I know these giving handshake hand applause is kind of awkward in these Zooms, but I think we all really appreciate, and everyone can do the virtual version, right? Please. So thank you again. This was really interesting, quite novel for me anyways. And there's a number of questions in the chat. Can you see them, Frédéric, and moderate questions in the chat, or should I read them aloud? See if you can read the chat. So, for example, Tanya said in Mexico's public policy, there is a sustainability approach, but the mechanisms of control limits the way in which the policy is understood and applied. Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I'm reading the first one.
Okay, sorry, go ahead. Also from Tanya, thank you.
Yeah.
So it's good to read them aloud because not every, I think we're recording this, we normally do. And to remove innovations is one of the most difficult changes in mindsets. Yeah, that also struck me. Do you want to comment?
Yeah. The mechanism of control rules on the policy. So I'm reading Tanya. Remove innovation is one of the most difficult changing mindset when it happens. Can we consider there is a seed of scaling the process? So what do you think about we in extension exercises are more focused in the direction? Interesting. I'm not sure I have the answer. What kind of tools or social technical evidence can we consider to document, measure the changes at the moment of chaos that is happening? Well, it depends, again, if chaos is really happening. This is the role of public policies and extension to the services to prevent chaos. Now, the question of indicator of tools is a quite deep question. I'm sorry, Tanya, I'm not sure I have the answer to your question. It's a bit difficult. Yeah, let me think about it. Reading the question of Eva. Or do you think that we could use chaos more as a window of opportunity for improvement following the example? Well, if we can use chaos, this is a very good question, because we can try to avoid chaos many times, but sometimes chaos can happen. Of course, we cannot prevent anything or everything or option that we don't want to see appearing. Using chaos, yeah, we can use the experience, but I'm still thinking that there are more disadvantages to chaos than advantages. So I think the better we can do to avoid chaos situation, the better is, because consequences can be very hard. And this is the question of anticipation. Then this is why we can see so much exercises of anticipation, forecasting, sciences, and all this kind of stuff. But how can we use chaos is a good question also. Not sure answering your question. In India, removal of fertilizer subsidies seems like a starting point of public policy. How do you rank around the public and the arguments for food security? Good question. Removing subsidies, yeah. This is a good question, and no, we can clearly see that removing something is not easy. This is perhaps why we have that preference to add something, because remove or exclude something is always complicated. This is always perhaps more complicated to remove something than to add something, because you have economic actors who are depending on those technologies or those policies. And when you try to break down from the existing, this is always complicated, and always with a lot of controversies, with a lot of argument pro, against, and this is always difficult. How we can address the issue of less yield, which comes with the alternatives and food and nutritional concerns in development. Well, big question, that one. I'm not the biologist or the agronomist who can say that some technologies works better than others, but this is of course a part of the debate. If you try to break with something, you have to prove to people that they're not going to lose, or perhaps they will lose something and gain other things. But of course, the evidence for that, this is not just about convincing people or talking to people that what they're doing is bad and they could do it better. Of course, you have to put the evidences. This is what we talk about social technical. This is not only about social processes. This is also about technical processes. This is not just about talking. You have to move facts. You have to get facts to demonstrate and convince people that those change are sustainable. And of course, you can have the best technology, but if the consequences that you are dividing your yields per two, okay, it's not going to work. Isn't the lack of this, Frédéric, isn't the lack of disruption you have described due to the fact that the social political landscape in which we tend to be lacking regime rather than more? Yes, I know, of course. Isn't the lack of disruption? Yeah, there were a study published, I think it was in Nature, that there are less and less disruptive innovation now than 50 years ago or 60 years ago. I'm not sure this is true, but of course, we are part of the social technical regimes. We are part of the incumbent regimes. We were taking the example the other day with some colleagues of CIRAD, where heavy investments in research and development in our Caribbean islands against the banana industry. Science and technology put a lot of money because that was the moment, and that was the industry that public policies wanted to develop and improve. But this is now today responding clearly to some needs of local societies. But these infrastructures and these investments are still here. So we have to keep running those infrastructures, those research infrastructures. So we are part, of course, we as researchers, we are part of those locking processes and those dependence we are creating when we are investing in some infrastructure or investing in some intellectual frameworks or conceptual frameworks. Of course, we are part of it. And we are part of institutions, we are part of forms of evaluations of the research work. So this is as difficult for us as for the rest of the people, of the economic actors of public policies. Yeah, Eva is doing promotion for the article that was published yesterday. Thank you, Eva. When we are precisely making some reflection about the X-curve and taking the example of conservation agriculture, about the importance of, at the same time, convince people to stop what they are doing and introduce some alternative and innovation. So you have the link in the chat and published just yesterday. SIG Factionite History, which move policy forward more in your experience. I read the US conservation side. A huge cloud. Yeah, of course. This is the story of the Dust Bowl and the conservation agriculture in the US. Yeah, storytelling for promoting some innovation, some new technologies, some big technological promises are, of course, always important to move policy forward. We know that we have to use it. We have to use those good example, and we need some facts. Of course, we need some facts. We need some evidences. And this is part of our work to give some evidences to public policies. And yeah, I think this is a good example of the case of conservation agriculture that I've been observing a lot in Europe. That was very interesting how some researchers and extension services and a lot of private consultants, this is what is happening also today with the biological inputs of those private consultants that are not really part of academic institutions, but with a strong scientific culture, are demonstrating or attracting attention from public policy, demonstrating how things are problematic today. You can do it for pesticides, and people did it a lot with conservation agriculture. When at the beginning of the 90s, the question of erosion, soil erosion, in particular in Europe, was not so strong. This is more a problem of, or mainly more a problem of tropical countries or tropical soil. That was not easy to demonstrate to public policies, to public administration, that erosion in France was a big problem. So they had to demonstrate it to build some storytelling about those problematization of existing practices about plowing. Should we concentrate on phasing out or on new disruptive, innovative, cost-reducing technology? We solve the problem like most of the startups. Well, I don't think that we have to make the choice, but what I tried to explain this morning is that both processes are useful. Both processes are almost everywhere for almost all technologies almost all innovation processes are coexisting. The importance of detach and attach. Attach people to new technology and detach people to some practices that we're doing. Of course, there are some disruptive innovation coming from nowhere and who are not replacing some existing technologies or practices. Of course, we have those cases. But as I said, it seems that there are less than before. And we always think, I think we should think that way. If you want to introduce something, you have to destabilize the routines of the people, the routines of the users, to demonstrate that what they are doing is not absolutely perfect, and that would be better, and that what they are doing have some negative consequences, or that they could improve their situation or their practices with those new technologies. So I keep thinking that both processes are really useful, and that we should consider it in the way we try to introduce some new technologies with farmers. And of course, this is a matter of adapting our discourses regarding to the kind of countries, societies, farmers, and public policies. Of course, this is not a standardized discourse that we have to get and we have to produce to all those kind of people. We have to adapt regarding to local situations. I don't know if you have some more questions.
Yeah, this has been really interesting question and answer. Raised some really good points, Frédéric. Back to Frédéric Bowden's point about lock-in traps. I think this is really interesting because obviously when we try and build alternatives, we are facing these, right? So I think you've given us some ways forward in terms of understanding how to support disruption in a positive way. Do you have any other comments on how we can help revisioning, maybe with our scientific partners as well as policymakers, as you've raised, and maybe with farmers? Any further thoughts on that?
In private sectors. If we consider the case of inputs, private sector and input companies are just indispensable for it. This is like an obligatory passage point for all kind of change of agricultural practices, because I don't know, this is not, I'm not saying that this is what we have to do, but if you see all the situation of public policies who are trying to reduce pesticide use, if you try to go against this industry, like frontally against this industry, perhaps this is not always the best way. I think that collaborating for designing some alternatives is always necessary, or at least important. So the message is that we have to consider, this is not so common when I'm saying for social sciences, because inputs companies, they were always considered like, or they were out of the scope of interest of the people that we are observing, or situation we are observing. I think we have to reintegrate those kind of actors, input companies, in our understanding of change, because they are actors of change. They are not only generating technologies, they are changing things in the field, on the ground. Because many, if we take the case of bio-inputs company, biocontrol or biofertilizers, most of these companies are selling themselves their products, because this is not the same thing using a chemical inputs or biological inputs. You have to learn a lot of things, how it works, how you have to apply, and how you have to spray, and how you have to use it to understand the effect on the crops, and who is really in capacity to do this. This is the company, these are the companies who are producing this technology. So they are actors of change on the ground. They are not only selling or designing technology. So we have to get those companies into our understanding of things, and perhaps into our strategies of change in the ground. So I think really that integrating in rural spaces, in rural society, integrating retailers, for instance, of inputs is really useful, because there are all farmers are in contact with those actors. They are all in contact with retailers. So if we use retailers, if we build a constructive relationship with those actors, we can use them, quotes, as actors of change, going into the direction we want to go.
Thank you for that. And I was just put in the chat about public-private civil society. I think that's a unique and important aspect of CIMMYT's strategic, particularly ag development vision, in addition to our basic research vision, because I think both are informed by that. So this is really timely, what you're presenting. I would just also comment something I've thought about over the years, having worked a lot on crop diversity and cover crops and ways we can, support regenerative agriculture, which indeed it requires plants as well as animals. So, plants and their associated microbes. So maybe we can engage some, those who sell seeds of cover crops. Perhaps that's too simplistic. And perhaps a bigger vision is more, many companies now, in order to continue to grow and have financing, need to show their sustainability footprint. But again, I think it's public-private partnerships, because public investments in integrated pest management, in conservation agriculture for the public good can also help move this forward. But as you said, private sector, where are those engagement points? I think you've really got us thinking about this. So I really appreciate this again. It is almost the hour. So I just want to thank everyone for their time today and for your leadership and really vision that you've presented today. Frédéric, it's really appreciated, and look forward to your engagement with CIMMYT in the coming year. So everyone knows how to find you and how to email you. So hopefully they will follow up. So thank you again. And any final comments?
No, thank you very much. My pleasure. And of course, I will be happy to keep talking about that and collaborating with all the colleagues from CIMMYT everywhere, not only in Mexico.
Great. Now they all know you. All right. Thank you again, everyone.
Thanks to all of you.
Don't forget Science Week coming up mid-March, and we'll get to see each other in person. Great. Thank you. Bye-bye.